Alright, just gonna be another fast video, so this just proves yet again Alex's claims about him knowing everything about World War II. Either he's lying about that, or he just doesn't even know what he's talking about. And maybe he did read books about World War II and stuff like that, but reading books and doing actual research are two completely different things. If you read a book and you don't care to check the sources or to read alternative theories on it, you're doing nothing but basically memorizing somebody's contention. You're not trying to figure out the truth. You're not, because he always sits there and says, "Oh, I read William Schreier. I read William Schreier." Well, pretty sure even William Schreier doesn't get this wrong.
Worried about with Trump when they bring up something like, "What's Aleppo?" Syria. It's where the most lives have been lost. The city is kind of like the Leningrad or Stalingrad of Russia, where it just goes back and forth on both sides. And the war was basically decided in Leningrad, then Stalingrad, changing the name. Now St. Petersburg.
And you see how he tries to cover it up because he doesn't know what he's talking about. So, anybody who knows anything about World War II and has even watched a History Channel and become a History Channel historian knows that Stalingrad was finished way before Leningrad. I mean, really, people, this is just the basics of World War II. And then he makes the most ridiculous History Channel claim that all armchair historians make, that Leningrad and Stalingrad decided World War II. No, because Stalingrad ended in 1943, and the war was already lost by the beginning of 1942. And people are going to be like, well, how is that possible? Well, in the winter of 1941, when the troops, the Wehrmacht, was close to Moscow, I mean, they were within a 100-mile distance, they were stopped short of the capital. And that's not the problem. The problem that came was after that. What happened was, after that, they had a winter that was so severe, and basically what happened was Hitler didn't plan on the campaign lasting more than a few months. So the normal army, that is the regular Wehrmacht, basically just the army, not the SS troops or anything like that, but the regular army wasn't prepared at all for the winter. Not only was the army not prepared for the winter, even the Luftwaffe wasn't prepared for the winter either. Same with the tanks weren't even there are stories about tanks breaking down in winter because the engines just weren't made to run in such severe climate conditions. Same with the airplanes. And this mainly relies on, obviously, Hitler and everybody else planning for the war, thinking that's going to be 1, 2, 3, like that the Eastern Front is going to be essentially the same as the Western Front, when in the West there were complex roads. There were basically everything in the West was industrialized. There were, like I said, roads everywhere. There were bridges everywhere. In the East, it's mainly all swamps and farmlands and rural, more like peasant areas. And they didn't really take this into account. A lot of their tanks got stopped in place because instead of having tracks on the tanks, they had actual wheels. And they got stuck, especially when it started raining, and definitely during the winter. And what happened during the winter is this was the deciding factor. This is why the 1941 winter was the deciding factor of the war. They lost over 100,000 troops in that winter alone. And most of them were from disease and from frostbite. And it was a devastating winter. It really was. Look it up. The winter after the Moscow battle basically broke down, because they were basically outside of Moscow, but it broke down and then winter kicked in, and that's essentially when they got really hit heavy with the Russian army, because the Russian army was trained for the winter. They came in on skis. They had tons of gear, but the thing is, the Russians weren't nearly as well trained. They were better equipped than the Germans. We get this picture in our head where the Germans are the superior equipped, and they just basically had better equipment. No, it was the exact opposite. The Russians had the better tanks. They had the better weapons. They had the clothing, the gear. The only difference was the Germans were better fighters. They were better strategic, whatever you want to say. Strategically, they were better. They had better planning. They didn't piecemeal their tanks. They had their armored units together. So essentially, when they got in tank battles, it was almost a massacre because they had a bunch of tanks facing a couple tanks and infantry on the other side. And that's the only reason why the campaign in Africa lasted so long, because Rommel was so good at that. He was so good at piecemealing the British, because they would just have a couple tanks and then a bunch of infantry. Whereas Rommel would basically coordinate all of his tanks together, and he would just roll them over, because, I mean, what are you going to do if you only have 2 tanks and the enemy brings 30 at once? I mean, you don't stand a chance, even with all the infantry in the world. But that's besides the point. And this was the deciding factor. It wasn't Stalingrad, it wasn't Leningrad. The only people who consider that are people who haven't really researched quite into World War II to know the actual intricacies of the battles. That was the deciding factor, because even after that, even after 1941, there was one more offensive campaign in the spring of 42 where the Germans did push a little bit forward, but they had already lost so many troops. They had lost the moral victory. Well, not victory, but yeah, essentially they did have a moral victory over the Allies, because they had completely destroyed the West, and they didn't have the confidence anymore after that winter. And they felt like the higher office, Hitler and them, had maybe neglected the army, because the SS troops were well equipped. The SS troops were fully clothed. They had everything they needed, because they planned for that. But whereas the army didn't plan for that, because they really thought they were just gonna run over the Soviets, just like they did in the